Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV, being broadcast to you live, not only on satellite, but also online on Facebook and Twitter Live as well on BMTV's social media channels. Today, we're going to be discussing the issue of refugee racism, specifically when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Now, the phrase civilized people, and I use that in quotation marks, of course, has become ever more relevant ever since the situation in Ukraine erupted, hasn't it? And especially with Ukrainians who are fleeing then over the border of their own country into neighboring countries, looking for refuge and safety from war, especially women and children, of course. Now, as those people have been fleeing their own country, there's been a number of issues that have come up vis-a-vis racism. Firstly, about how media itself speaks about Ukrainians fleeing their country as civilized people, as already mentioned, versus those of Syrians, Afghans, and others who have sought refuge on the shores of Europe, being essentially seen as uncivilized. And then on top of that, we also have people of color who have sought refuge from Ukraine into then other European countries, those who were in Ukraine, either working or studying or otherwise, and the way that they have been treated at, for example, the Polish border or in other borders as well across Europe also. Now, this is at a time when in the past we've had talk of, refugees from the Middle East and North Africa being spoken of as an invasion of refugees. There's still talk, and there still has been talk on the part of media and politicians in Europe of, the fact that these people who come from the Middle East and North Africa do not assimilate well into the societies of Europe versus that of Ukrainians who are white and blue-eyed, according to many politicians and media spokespeople who view them as, hey, they can fit into our societies, and so we should have them in and welcome them in at the same time. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined by our esteemed panelists, Hamourtziadou, who is a senior lecturer in criminology with security studies at Birmingham City University's School of Social Sciences. She's also a lead researcher with the Iraq Body Count. And joining us is Saeed A, who is a lecturer in the Department of Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University, Detroit, and is also a research fellow at Wayne State University's Center for the Study of Citizenship. Saeed and Lily, thank you both for taking your time out to join us here on BMTV's The Scope today. Lily, I'd like to start with you, if I may, and just at the top of this, I use that phrase, civilized people. I wonder how you react to that, because the implicit narrative then is that anybody else is uncivilized, isn't it?
Yes, and in fact, this civilized is one of many comments that I heard in the media. One was that this is not a developing third world nation, this is Europe, these people look like any European family, and so on. How I reacted, it hurt me to hear it, and it very much fit with the way the media have been treating my work for Iraq Body Count. So I've given many interviews over the last 16 years on Iraq. And at Iraq Body Count, we monitor the impact of the invasion and subsequent wars on the civilian population of Iraq. And often I'm asked, why do you do this? Why are you monitoring this? Why are you counting the deaths? Why are you trying to give names to those who die? Why are you monitoring the refugee situation? As though it would be of no significance that people are being killed, that people are becoming displaced, that people grow up in refugee camps. So I suppose it was expected by me, because I see that the media try very hard to pass on to the public in the UK that people in the Middle East, they're always fighting, they're like that, it doesn't matter, it's almost normal that there will be conflicts, that there will be refugees, that there will be poverty. So it upset me, but it didn't surprise me.
Saeed, what are your thoughts on that? Because there was no less an American journalist, and I'm not going to put him on the spot in this show, but it was no less an American journalist that seemed to have been one of the first ones that essentially made that mistake, if I may call it that, according to what he said it was, at least, speaking about the fact that, this is not something that people would expect that people would not expect these kinds of people with, with the kinds of skin color and faces and, citizenship that they have to be then seeking refuge in this way or to even be under attack.
Well, his name is Charlie D'Agata, and he's with CBS News, one of the major networks in the US. And I think he needs to be named because I think it's important for people to then be vigilant about not only him, but people of his ilk. Well, first of all, it's a little bit ironic because the alleged lack of civility in some of the countries to which he was referring, like Iraq, were quite civil until Western intervention. So if there's anything that then drew the line of demarcation between the so-called civilized and uncivilized world, it is by the so-called civilized world making people violent for their own strategic purposes and priorities. I think that there's another important triad here, Waqar, that we need to go ahead and examine when it comes to the racism that is now fairly blatant in the coverage. I don't think that it's isolated to one incident, as my colleague has said. She was shocked by just the sheer avalanche of the tropes coming out. But there's different kinds of racism here. True, we have one regarding the refugees, but then there's these broader areas. First of all, it is only now convenient for Ukraine to be considered Western and European. That is not something that has existed historically. And then there is the ability to try to offset Ukraine with, as we have seen with these comments and aspersions, the so-called developing world. And then there's the third one about offsetting Ukraine with Russia. And whether Russia is really Western or European. And it's interesting to hear some of these remarks that are also being made, that somehow or the other, Russia does not share Western values. And I've heard journalists as recently as yesterday make this comment, that Russia does not share, quote unquote, our values. They are something else. So when it's convenient, Russia, despite having quite a foothold in Europe, is now something else. Ukraine similarly has this rather bipolar identity to it. And we cannot forget, of course, that many of these countries that surround the Ukraine, that are part of Eastern Europe, have been the subject and the source of a tremendous amount of politicization and racism in countries like Great Britain. After all, one of the reasons why Brexit came about was because of Romania and Romanians being seen as infiltrating Great Britain as well as Poles. So this idea of a very fluid line between the so-called West and the so-called East are just presenting themselves in many different ways with the Ukraine crisis.
Indeed, and I'm glad, Lily, that Saeed brought up that point, because I wanted to ask you about that as well, right? That this is not just limited to what we may speak about, of course, people from the Middle East and North Africa, but also just within Europe itself, the sort of lines that we have had drawn about people who are acceptable to move across these borders of Europe and to live and to work in other places and seek better, even economic opportunities. What are your thoughts about that? That now Europe seems to have united?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say Europe has united, actually. Coming from the UK, I know the UK always puts itself apart from the rest of Europe. So I wouldn't go so far, but it seems to me that where the Ukraine lies, almost between East and West, kind of like the Middle East, is like a fault line. So it's an area much like the Middle East, where there is conflict because the great powers are fighting over interests and areas of dominance. And so, in a way, it's expected that there will be crisis, there will be instability, much like in the Middle East. I don't think of them as being that different, actually. And I do like that Saeed Khan made this further distinction about, well, is this European? Is that European? What is European? And that is fluid. And it changes based on interests and based on who is invading where. We see Russia being demonized as a sort of evil empire almost. And yet when I explain to my students, what the UK-US coalition did in the Middle East, because it was protecting their interests, they think this is normal. Oh yes, well, of course, this is what great powers do, to protect their interests. But in that case, that is not acceptable if the great power is Russia. So we see these categories changing the way interests change and based on who is using weapons.
Yeah, and say just before going to break, I wanted to ask you, in fact, about how the Russians are viewed at this time. You've already mentioned that, but also just then in the sense of even how that conversation, and for a while now, Russia has been seen in a negative light. And I'm not saying that there is not a lot that Russia does not have to answer for, certainly, but I'm saying in the sense that, do you think that this has been something that has been building for a long time as far as narrative even goes?
Well, part of the narrative about Russia was, of course, forged in the crucible of the Cold War. Depending on certain European countries and their histories with Russia, I would suggest that it's something that even predates it, whether it was during the Franco-Russian wars of Napoleon, whether it was the Anglo-Russian wars that even found their way into the Indian subcontinent and Afghanistan. The otherization of Russia has occurred for quite a while. It's also important to recognize that there's actually a split of opinion in Russia in the so-called West. White nationalists, for example, Christian nationalists, they hail Vladimir Putin as some kind of new leper messiah. Here is somebody who is going to save Christianity even from European secular heathenism, it seems. And so he certainly has a lot of currency. I think it's important to remember that former President Donald Trump not only lauded him while he was in office, but even up until the invasion of Ukraine, really loved him. So I think that the jury's still out regarding Russia, and I don't think we should necessarily fall into the trap of seeing it as being a consensus opinion about it.
Sure, we're just about to go into break, and I just want to let our viewers know that you can certainly send in your comments. We have our WhatsApp number displayed for you, and you can certainly send in your comments and your thoughts, even on our Facebook Live. Also, after the break, we will continue discussing this issue with Lily and Saeed. And I want to then hone in on the discussion of the fact that who is an acceptable refugee for Europe? And does Europe have a point to say that it should want people who it feels can assimilate society, such as those who are, if I may be honest, Christian, white, etc.? Is that what Europe should be aiming for? Does it have a point to say that those are the kinds of people that should show up in stores? See before that right after this break. Welcome back, everyone, to The Scope here on BNTV. We're continuing to discuss refugee racism and just racism in general, as we've seen it in the context of the evolving situation in Ukraine and the conflict there. I'm continuing to be joined by Lily and Saeed, who we're speaking with about this issue. And in this session, I want to really hone in on the more sensitive issues of society, really, and whether or not assimilation should really be an issue. And Lily, the politicians that I implied spoke about this issue. Some of them, and there's a Spanish MP that I can point to, a Greek MP that I can also point to, and there are others across Europe as well, who have made the point that, listen, Ukrainians are by and large Christians, they're by and large white in identity, that they fit in more into society, that they're more educated, at least in comparison in their eyes and these politicians' eyes, to those who would show up at European shores from, for example, the Middle East or North Africa. Do they have a point in that it would be easier for a Ukrainian to be able to assimilate into, for example, Polish society versus a Syrian or an Afghan?
Well, yes, they do have a point in that it would be easy for them to assimilate, even because of the way they look, and because they're described as middle class. Not as poor and illiterate and uncivilized. So it will be easy for them to fit in. Also because they are part of a narrative that sees those who are driving them out as bad people. So they will be welcomed, they will be protected, and that will make it easier for them to assimilate. At least short term, because long term, they'd be looking to go back home. Whereas when it came to refugees from the Middle East, at least in the UK, they were not as welcome because the UK was very much a reason why these people were fleeing their country. So for that reason, they couldn't say, oh, well, those who drove them out are evil and we need to protect them, because Britain was one of the powers that was driving them out. So it's twofold. One is race and color. The other is who is actually creating this problem of refugees.
And you know, Saeed, the United States is not immune to this sort of thing. We've had Donald Trump not too long ago speaking about Mexicans, for example, in very negative terms. And, you know, there is this widespread view that Mexicans also do not necessarily assimilate very well within the United States as well. And that is, of course, in certain quarters. I'm saying not all Americans would think that. But do you think that that is something that should be of concern for countries taking in such people?
Well, it really depends on the national narrative. I mean, in the United States, it has been known to be a nation of immigrants. And assimilation then now, with discussions and debates from people like former President Trump and his ilk, focus around the idea that does America have not just an immigrant identity, but an ethos that is based on being white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. Well, if that is then the essential identity upon which everyone should try to assimilate or to yield to the dominance of that particular identity category, then it creates a certain kind of an expectation. In the United States, it would be ridiculous to even consider that anymore, given the demographic shifts. Within 20 years, America is going to become a majority-minority country. Hispanic culture is now rife everywhere in the United States. I think if there is a white nationalist who is enjoying a taco, perhaps he or she should go ahead and reconsider their dietary preferences. That is how America has been defined as a land of opportunity and immigrants and a so-called melting pot. Now that's different in Europe. And I would make one respectful concern regarding how well the Ukrainians might be welcome into Poland. Poland is a Catholic country, whereas Ukraine is an Eastern Orthodox country. As memory serves, 1,000 years ago, there was a divorce between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. We don't know if that's going to then be a line of demarcation and division. Now, race might prevail over religious difference, even though cultures certainly are affected by religious distinctions. Now, for example, myself, I speak the Queen's English, I like the Beatles, and I have a fondness for cricket. I should be the dream and fantasy for every Briton to have me be British. But of course, we understand that British identity is categorized something differently, even though I do, along with an American passport, have a British passport. So I think that when we're looking at identity, which is then tied into assimilation, I think the issue or the question is perhaps less about whether Ukrainians and other refugees can assimilate than if European countries can decide once and for all how they define themselves.
And, you know, Lily, another argument that is put forward, and I'm just putting these arguments to both you and Saeed because I really want to get your thoughts on them as well. Another argument put forward to defend Europe's stance right now in the face of Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country and accepting them in more readily than accepting in Middle Easterners or North Africaners is that, you know, those people from the MENA region, for example, should actually be, even according to international law, first processed in countries within that region. Before then, they are possibly allowed to then move on to European shores. And the Ukraine is, for all intents and purposes, in Europeans' eyes, European itself. So how do you feel about that argument about, you know, the law, international law, and how it feels about refugees and what shores they should show up at first versus not?
Well, look, a country that against international law invades another in a completely unprovoked attack will not convince me that they actually stick to laws and rules when it comes to, say, refugees. You know, also in this country, we supposedly have multiculturalism, and yet there's something called British values. that everybody needs to be adhering to. So, yes, okay, there are rules and there are laws, but they get broken all the time when it suits the dominant countries. And it is actually the weak that are forced to stick to laws. It seems the laws are made just for the weak.
Saeed, does Lily have a point there? Is the law just when it comes to the weak? Because, yes, it can even be argued when it comes to Ukraine that there have been some, loopholes used in certain cases.
Well, it's also weakness when it comes to socioeconomics. If somebody can make their way out of a country to a friendly country and apply at an embassy there, it may be very costly, but at the same time, it's able to achieve the purpose at hand. Now, in this case, it's a little bit ridiculous for countries to demand that the processing occur in the Ukraine when they themselves have evacuated those embassies and the very bureaucrats who would be in the position to process the refugees and their applications. There is, of course, another element of international law, which is asylum. Refugee status is something that is sought and applied for in a country outside that which is the destination. But asylum law is a long-held tradition and practice of so-called Western countries, where if you show up, you are entitled to the due process. You will then be processed for whatever is your claim, as long as it is something that is meritorious. That will occur. I seem to recall that back during the Cold War, hundreds, if not thousands of people would show up as athletes or as musicians or other culture producers and defect, simply try to evade their minders at a tennis tournament or a chess tournament and say, we want to gain asylum. And given the high public profile of individuals like Mikhail Baryshnikov or any number of, as I said before, tennis athletes from Czechoslovakia back then, or Russia or the Soviet Union, they were not only granted asylum in the United States and in Western countries, but the red carpet was rolled out for them. So I think that it's difficult not to approach it, as Lily also has stated, with a certain level of skepticism and outright cynicism.
Lily, I was just reading a number of Twitter threads today, and I want to put this to you because it seems, at least for me, a very amateur way of viewing people's views in Europe. And that was about Nigerian refugees who were at a Polish border and the way that they were being treated, not Nigerian refugees, I should say, in fact, Nigerians who were living and studying in Ukraine, who were seeking to flee Ukraine and seeking refuge in other European countries, and the way they were treated. And, many of the comments were saying, why didn't the Nigerian embassy do more for these people? Why didn't it come in and swoop in and help its own people? Is that the correct narrative at this time? Should we be concentrating then on those individual countries and how they take care of their citizens versus allowing these people refuge?
Yeah, absolutely not. These people, we see again that there are two distinct categories of people almost. Those that have priority over being protected from being killed, and those that need to wait their turn. And that to me is absolutely diabolical. And I am really surprised that no more is being said about it, about the fact that there are, in a way, 2 degrees. There is the first degree who can leave and be safe and be protected, and those who, maybe yes, maybe no, maybe later, show us your papers. Why should they have to do that? Isn't all humanity the same?
Indeed. And Saeed, I just wanted to give you 30 seconds, if you can, very quickly to also respond to that. What are your thoughts about that sort of double standard?
Well, first of all, it assumes or presumes that the Nigerians haven't tried to extricate their own people. But I think when you have a crisis of this magnitude and of this level of trauma, you do notice that it is a collective effort. Reports are that the Pakistan embassy in Kyiv has opened up its doors to shelter and protect Indian expatriates that are in the Ukraine. And so while there may be tensions between countries overseas, it seems as though people are able to find a modus vivendi here. I don't see why Western countries with the resources that they have and certainly with the narrative that they have forged because of this conflict, could not come in and step up and do more.
Very well, Lily and Saeed, we really appreciate your taking your time out. I know you both have busy schedules, but I really appreciate you both joining us today here on The Scope on BMT. That's this very important issue, and I know we got through some very sensitive issues, and I'm glad we were able to have this very open discussion about that. And, we discussed things like how refugees are treated, coming from the MENA region, of course, but then, of course, also then those who are white and quote unquote civilized in their own eyes. What does that even mean? We'll, of course, be back next week at the same time and discussing other very important international issues here on this. We'll continue to send in, of course, your comments please, via Facebook and other means. Your WhatsApp number is right to the bottom of the screen. So thank you for watching.